No one expected a dog to interrupt a funeral, but when Max, the loyal German shepherd, lunged toward the casket and barked relentlessly, the entire room froze. The priest's face turned pale, his hands trembling as he tried to calm the crowd. Yet Max wouldn't stop. His sharp, desperate barks echoed through the church, sending chills down everyone's spine. And that's when Ethan noticed something strange, something that would unravel a terrifying secret and change the lives of everyone in the room forever. No one expected a dog to interrupt a funeral. But when Max, the loyal German shepherd, lunged toward the casket and barked relentlessly, the entire room froze. The priest's face turned pale, his hands trembling as he tried to calm the crowd. Yet Max wouldn't stop. His sharp, desperate barks echoed through the church, sending chills down everyone's spine. And that's when Ethan noticed something strange, something that would unravel a terrifying secret and change the lives of everyone in the room forever. Before I dive deeper into this chilling mystery, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever witnessed a moment where an animal seemed to sense danger before anyone else, hit that like button, because Max's story might just make you believe in miracles. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Max's behavior wasn't random. There was intent in the dog's eyes, a silent plea for someone to listen. As Ethan knelt beside Max, the dog stopped barking for a brief moment, fixing his gaze directly on the casket. The room fell silent. Whispers rippled through the pews, and nervous glances darted toward the priest, whose unease was becoming impossible to ignore. "Sit down and let us proceed," the priest demanded, his voice cracking under pressure. But Ethan wasn't convinced. He placed a gentle hand on Max's head, feeling the dog tremble under his touch. "What are you trying to show us, boy?" he whispered, his eyes narrowing as he turned back toward the casket. Max let out a low growl, and the hair on his neck bristled. Something was wrong. Ethan could feel it. The priest took a step closer, wiping sweat from his brow, but his forced smile did little to ease the tension. "This is ridiculous," he stammered. "We need to focus on honoring Eleanor's memory, not causing a scene." But Ethan wasn't backing down. He stood up, his voice steady but firm. "Maybe we're not the ones causing a scene," he said, locking eyes with the priest. "Maybe Max sees something we don't." The priest's face darkened, and for the first time, fear flickered in his eyes. That's when Ethan knew. There was more to this funeral than anyone was willing to admit. And Max wasn't just barking at shadows. He was trying to protect them all. Ethan's heart pounded as Max's growls grew deeper, vibrating through the tense silence of the church. All eyes were now fixed on the casket, but it was the priest who drew Ethan's attention. The man's trembling hands and shifting gaze betrayed something darker than grief, something Ethan couldn't ignore. Moving cautiously, Ethan stepped closer to the casket, his boots echoing softly against the wooden floor. Max followed, his body tense and ready. The priest took a sharp breath, stepping forward as if to block Ethan's path. "Stop!" His voice cracked, echoing through the vaulted ceiling. "This has gone far enough." But Ethan didn't stop. Neither did Max. The dog sniffed at the base of the casket, circling it with the kind of determination that sent chills down Ethan's spine. A murmur rippled through the crowd as whispers filled the air. Something wasn't right. Everyone felt it. Ethan knelt down and placed a steady hand on Max's back. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. Max barked once, sharp and commanding, before pawing at the corner of the casket. The sound of his claws scratching the wood sent a shiver through the room. The priest's voice broke the moment. "That's enough," he shouted, but this time desperation replaced authority. "This is blasphemy. Remove that dog immediately." Ethan stood and turned to face the priest. "Why are you so afraid, Father?" His words cut through the tension like a knife. "What's in this casket that has you so nervous?" The priest opened his mouth, but no words came out. Beads of sweat rolled down his temple as the crowd leaned in, waiting for an answer. When none came, Ethan took a deep breath and moved closer to the casket. His fingers brushed against the lid. But before he could open it, the priest lunged forward. "Don't touch it!" he roared, grabbing Ethan's arm with surprising strength. But Max was faster. The dog snarled and snapped, forcing the priest to stumble backward. Gasps echoed through the church as Ethan seized the moment. He gripped the edge of the casket and slowly lifted the lid. The hinges creaked, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. But as the lid fell open, the collective gasp of the crowd filled the room. What lay inside wasn't what anyone expected. Beneath the flowers and fabric, instead of Eleanor's body, there was something else entirely, a hidden compartment filled with bundles of cash, jewelry, and documents. It wasn't a casket, it was a vault. Ethan stepped back, his eyes wide as the truth hit him. Max barked again, this time not in fear but in triumph, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. The crowd erupted in whispers, accusations flying as people turned to face the priest. "You lied to us," someone shouted. "What else are you hiding?" The priest's face drained of color as he stumbled back, his hands raised as if to defend himself. But there was no defense, no explanation that could erase what they had just seen. And Ethan knew this was only the beginning. As the authorities led Father Thomas away, the church fell into an eerie silence. The crowd that had once been filled with whispers and accusations now stood frozen, grappling with the weight of the truth. Faces that once looked up to the priest with admiration were now clouded with disbelief and betrayal. Ethan stood near the casket, his gaze fixed on Eleanor's still form. The faint glow of the evening sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden pews, but the beauty of it felt hollow. Max sat beside him, his ears perked as if still guarding the room, unwilling to relax even with the priest gone. Slowly the murmurs returned, this time softer, tinged with sorrow instead of anger. "How could this happen?" a woman whispered, clutching her husband's arm. Others shook their heads, unable to comprehend how someone they trusted had harbored such darkness. Ethan's eyes moved across the room, stopping on Eleanor's portrait resting near the altar. Her kind smile seemed to watch over them, as if urging them to remember the good she had brought to their lives despite the tragedy that had unfolded. He stepped forward and gently closed the lid of the casket, a silent promise that her story wouldn't end in shadows. Max let out a soft whimper, breaking the moment of quiet. Ethan knelt beside him, running a hand through the dog's fur. "We'll make this right," he said, his voice steady but low. "For Eleanor, and for everyone." The villagers began to gather closer, no longer afraid but united by a shared determination. They asked questions, not just about Eleanor, but about what they could do to rebuild, how to move forward without the burden of deceit. It was clear that Father Thomas's crimes had shaken more than their faith. They had left a wound that would take time to heal. Ethan addressed them with calm resolve. "This wasn't just about the money or the lies," he said. "It was about trust. And trust doesn't disappear overnight. It's rebuilt piece by piece." Heads nodded and someone in the crowd murmured, "We'll start today." The words spread like ripples through the group, and slowly they began to clear the room, offering comfort to one another as they went. Ethan lingered behind, watching as the last of the villagers left. Max stayed by his side, his tail wagging gently now, as if sensing that the worst was over. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, more to learn about Eleanor's life and the secrets she had uncovered before it was too late. Turning to the dog, he gave a faint smile. "Come on, Max," he said, stepping toward the door. "We've got more work to do." Together, they walked out of the church and into the fading light, leaving behind the shadows of betrayal but carrying with them the promise of truth and the hope of a new beginning. The evening air was crisp as Ethan and Max stepped outside the church, the weight of the day still pressing heavily on Ethan's shoulders. The streets of the village, usually filled with quiet chatter and laughter, now felt unnervingly still. Shadows stretched long across the cobblestones as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind an amber glow that seemed to whisper of secrets yet to be uncovered. Max trotted ahead, his nose close to the ground, as if he too wasn't ready to let the mystery rest. Ethan followed, his thoughts circling the events of the day. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the image of Eleanor lying hidden beneath the casket, her story silenced but not forgotten. He knew there were still unanswered questions, pieces of the puzzle that hadn't yet fallen into place. His steps led him toward Eleanor's house, a small stone cottage at the edge of the village. The windows were dark, and the garden was overgrown, but there was something about the place that pulled him in. Max paused at the gate, letting out a soft bark as if encouraging Ethan to move forward. The door creaked open under Ethan's touch, revealing a dim, dust-filled room frozen in time. Photographs hung on the walls, their faded edges curling slightly, and a faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. It felt like stepping into a memory, one filled with warmth and quiet moments that now felt impossibly distant. Ethan moved carefully, his footsteps muffled by the worn rug beneath his feet. Max padded alongside him, sniffing at corners and furniture as if searching for something unseen. In the far corner of the room, Ethan noticed a small desk with papers scattered across its surface. He approached, his fingers brushing over handwritten notes and faded letters. One letter caught his eye. It was addressed to Eleanor but unsigned. The words, though hurried and slightly smudged, sent a chill through Ethan's spine. "We can't let them find out. If they do, everything falls apart. Meet me by the old well at midnight." Ethan's pulse quickened. The old well, it was a place most villagers avoided, surrounded by overgrown weeds and long-forgotten stories. He glanced at Max, who seemed to sense the shift in energy, and wagged his tail, ready to move. By the time they reached the well, darkness had fully settled over the village. The moon hung low in the sky, casting silvery light across the clearing. Max circled the edge, sniffing cautiously before letting out a sharp bark. Ethan stepped closer, peering down into the shadows below. The faint glint of metal caught his eye. Without hesitation, he grabbed a nearby branch and reached into the well, carefully pulling out a small rusted lockbox. Max barked again, this time more urgently, as Ethan pried it open. Inside, beneath layers of dust, lay a collection of documents, photographs, and a small leather-bound journal. Ethan flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the scribbled notes and sketches. Eleanor had been investigating something far bigger than the priest's theft, something that hinted at corruption spreading beyond the village. As the pieces began to fall into place, Ethan's chest tightened. Eleanor hadn't just been trying to expose Father Thomas. She had uncovered evidence of a network, one that reached far beyond their small town and had cost her life to reveal. Max barked sharply again, pulling Ethan back to the present. Footsteps rustled in the distance. Someone was coming. Ethan snapped the lockbox shut and tucked it under his arm. "Let's go," he whispered, and Max took off beside him as they disappeared into the night. The village wasn't done revealing its secrets, and neither was Ethan. The night wrapped around Ethan and Max like a cloak as they moved swiftly through the narrow paths leading away from the well. The weight of the lockbox pressed against Ethan's side, its contents burning in his thoughts. The soft crunch of leaves underfoot was the only sound, but every shadow seemed alive. Every gust of wind felt like a whisper warning him to turn back. Max stayed close, his ears twitching at the faintest noise. When they reached the edge of the village, Ethan paused to catch his breath, leaning against an old oak tree. The moonlight filtered through the branches, casting fragmented patterns on the ground. Max sat at his feet, eyes locked on the path they just traveled, his body tense as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the darkness. Ethan opened the lockbox again, this time more carefully. The journal rested on top, its leather cover worn and cracked, but the pages inside were filled with Eleanor's delicate handwriting. As he read, pieces of the puzzle began to snap into place. Eleanor had been tracking strange transactions, tracing donations that vanished without a trace, and funds funneled through the church to accounts no one could explain. But it was the last entry that made Ethan's blood run cold. "I was right to be afraid. Someone has been following me, watching. I saw him outside my window again tonight. I need to finish this before it's too late." Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of the page. She hadn't been paranoid. She'd been hunted. And now he realized whoever had tried to silence Eleanor might still be watching. Max suddenly growled low in his throat, snapping Ethan's attention back to the present. Footsteps crunched in the distance. Not one pair, several. Ethan quickly shut the box and tucked it under his jacket. "Come on, Max," he whispered, and they moved deeper into the woods, sticking to the shadows. The footsteps grew louder. Whoever was following them wasn't bothering to stay quiet anymore. Ethan pushed forward, his heart pounding. He didn't dare look back until he reached the old mill on the outskirts of the village. It stood abandoned, its weathered beams creaking softly in the night breeze. Ethan slipped inside, Max following close behind. The air was thick with the scent of dust and damp wood, but it offered cover. He crouched down, pressing his back against the wall as the footsteps stopped just outside. Max growled again, but Ethan placed a hand on his head, calming him. Seconds stretched into minutes. The silence was deafening. Then came a voice, low, steady, and far too familiar. "Ethan!" It was Father Thomas. Ethan's breath caught. He was supposed to be in custody. The authorities had taken him away, hadn't they? "You can't hide forever," the priest called out, his voice echoing off the mill's rotting walls. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Max's growl deepened, but Ethan stayed still. He could hear more footsteps now, moving closer. There was more than just the priest. Others were with him. Ethan's mind raced. Who were they? And how had Thomas escaped? "I know you're scared," the priest continued, his tone almost soothing, "but you don't understand what you're dealing with. That lockbox, it's bigger than Eleanor, bigger than this village. You think you're protecting the truth, but all you're doing is putting yourself in danger." Ethan's grip tightened around the lockbox. He didn't trust a word Thomas said, not after everything he'd done. "We'll find you," Thomas said, his voice fading as the footsteps began to move again, circling the mill. "And when we do, you'll wish you'd left this alone." Ethan stayed frozen until the sound of footsteps faded into the distance. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. Max whined softly, pressing against his leg for reassurance. Ethan looked down at the lockbox, its contents now feeling heavier than ever. He knew he couldn't run forever. Whatever Eleanor had uncovered wasn't just a scandal. It was a web of lies and corruption that stretched far beyond what he had imagined. And if Thomas was free, it meant the people pulling the strings were still out there, watching, waiting. Ethan straightened, his resolve hardening. He had come too far to turn back now. With Max by his side, he stepped out of the mill and into the night, knowing that the fight for the truth was far from over. The night felt heavier as Ethan and Max emerged from the mill, their footsteps muffled by the damp earth beneath them. The village lay in silence, its narrow streets shrouded in shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. Ethan's grip on the lockbox tightened, his mind racing through the priest's words. He couldn't shake the feeling that Father Thomas's escape hadn't been an accident. Someone had helped him, someone who still had power in this village. Max trotted beside him, ears twitching with every sound. The dog's presence was grounding, but Ethan knew they couldn't linger. Whoever was after them wouldn't stop, and the lockbox in his hands was more than evidence. It was a threat to whoever had orchestrated this web of deceit. Ethan's destination was clear. He needed to reach Eleanor's cottage again, but this time, not to search for clues. He needed to hide what he had found. The old house was one of the few places that hadn't yet been touched by prying eyes, and it might buy him enough time to figure out his next move. The journey back felt longer, each creak of a branch or rustle of leaves making his pulse quicken. When they reached the edge of the clearing, Max paused, his body tense as he sniffed the air. Ethan crouched low, scanning the surroundings. It was quiet, too quiet. He pushed forward, his instincts screaming at him to move quickly. The door to Eleanor's house groaned as it opened, and Ethan slipped inside, bolting it behind him. Max paced near the window, his eyes locked on the darkness outside. Ethan set the lockbox on the kitchen table and lit the single lantern that still worked. Its flickering glow cast shadows across the walls, but it was enough to see. He opened the box again, this time pulling out the journal and flipping to the final pages. Eleanor's last entries detailed late-night meetings and whispered warnings from someone she trusted, someone she only referred to as the stranger. Ethan's eyes narrowed. If Eleanor had trusted this person enough to share what she'd found, then there was a chance he or she might still be in the village. But finding them wouldn't be easy, especially with Thomas and his accomplices lurking in the shadows. Suddenly, Max growled low, his body rigid as he stared at the door. Ethan froze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. They stopped just outside. Ethan extinguished the lantern, plunging the room into darkness. Max stood ready, his eyes reflecting what little moonlight slipped through the curtains. The handle of the door rattled, but it didn't open. Instead, there was a voice, a low, unfamiliar voice. "You can't hide forever, Ethan." The words sent a chill down his spine. They weren't shouted or angry. They were calm, calculated, a warning. The footsteps retreated, but Ethan didn't move. He waited, listening until the sounds faded completely. When he finally exhaled, he turned to Max and whispered, "We're not staying here." Gathering the journal and lockbox, Ethan slipped out the back door, sticking to the shadows as he made his way toward the one place no one would think to look, the abandoned chapel on the far edge of town. Max stayed close, his nose low to the ground, as if following a trail only he could sense. The chapel stood like a forgotten relic, its stone walls cracked and covered in ivy. Ethan pushed open the door, and the hinges groaned in protest. Dust filled the air as they stepped inside, but it was dry and hidden, a place to regroup. Ethan set the lockbox down and leaned against the wall, his breath finally slowing. But just as he began to feel the first flicker of relief, Max let out a low, rumbling growl. Ethan turned and saw what the dog had already sensed. Footprints in the dust. Fresh ones. Someone had been here. Before he could react, a shadow moved near the altar. Ethan tensed, his heart hammering in his chest. And then the figure stepped forward. A man older than Ethan, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through the dim light. "You're not the first to look for answers," the man said, his voice steady but cold. "But if you're not careful, you'll end up just like her." Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he squared his shoulders and looked the man in the eye. "Then maybe it's time someone finished what she started." The man studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly. "You'd better hope you're ready," he said, "because they won't stop until this dies with you." Max growled softly and Ethan tightened his grip on the journal. He didn't know who this man was or whether he could be trusted. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not even close. The man's words lingered in the air, heavy and unshakable. Ethan didn't move, his fingers tightening around the edges of the journal. Max stayed close, his eyes never leaving the stranger, ready to react at the slightest sign of danger. The flickering light from a broken stained glass window cast jagged shadows across the chapel walls, making the space feel smaller, more suffocating. "Who are you?" Ethan finally asked, his voice low but firm. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his boots scraping softly against the stone floor. "Someone who's been fighting this battle longer than you," he said, his tone hard but edged with exhaustion. "And someone who's lost more than you can imagine." Ethan didn't back down. "Then help me," he said. "Tell me what Eleanor found, what she died for." The man hesitated, his eyes flickering toward the journal in Ethan's hands. "She wasn't supposed to find it," he said quietly. None of this was meant to surface, but Eleanor didn't let things go. She kept digging. He took another step closer, his face now partially visible in the dim light. Lines of age and worry etched his features, and his eyes, though sharp, carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "She trusted someone she shouldn't have," he continued. "Someone who promised to help but betrayed her instead. That's why you need to be careful. You don't know how far this goes." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then tell me," he pressed. "How far does it go?" The man exhaled sharply, his gaze dropping to the lockbox. "Far enough to make people disappear," he said. "Far enough that Eleanor wasn't the first. And if you keep pushing, she won't be the last." The warning sent a chill down Ethan's spine, but he refused to let fear take hold. "Then let's end it," he said, stepping forward. "Help me finish what she started." The man studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "If you're serious about this, there's no turning back," he said. "You need to know that." "I know." The man motioned toward the lockbox. "Then you need to understand what you're holding," he said. "That isn't just evidence, it's leverage. And the people behind this, they'll do whatever it takes to get it back." Ethan glanced at Max, who stood steady and alert, then back at the man. "So what's the next step?" The man's expression darkened. "We don't wait for them to come to us," he said. "We go to them." Ethan's pulse quickened. "And who exactly are they?" The man's eyes met his, sharp and unyielding. "The ones who built this town on lies," he said, "and the ones who will burn it down to keep those lies buried." The words hung heavy in the air, but Ethan didn't waver. He reached for the lockbox and tucked it under his arm, feeling the weight of it like an anchor. Then let's make sure they don't get the chance. The man gave a short nod, already turning toward the chapel door. Max followed close behind, his tail low but his steps steady. Ethan cast one last glance at the altar, the faint glow of moonlight illuminating its cracked surface. He didn't know what waited for them beyond those doors, but one thing was certain. This fight was far from over, and he wasn't about to back down. Not now. Not ever. The night air was sharp as Ethan stepped out of the chapel, the lockbox clutched tightly under his arm. The man who had yet to give his name moved ahead with deliberate steps, scanning the shadows like someone who had spent years looking over his shoulder. Max stayed close to Ethan's side, his ears perked and eyes sharp, every muscle in his body tense and ready. The village was eerily silent, as though it, too, was holding its breath. Streetlights flickered in the distance, their glow barely cutting through the fog that had rolled in, wrapping around the buildings like ghostly fingers. Ethan felt it, a presence, an unseen weight pressing down on the air. He didn't need to ask if they were being watched. He already knew. They reached the edge of town, where the cobblestones faded into dirt paths that wound through the forest. The man stopped suddenly, turning to face Ethan. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice low but urgent. "They know you have it, and they'll come for you." Ethan met his gaze. "Then let's not waste it." The man nodded and started walking again, leading them deeper into the trees. The canopy above seemed to close in, swallowing the last traces of moonlight. The air grew heavier, damp with the scent of earth and moss. Max moved ahead, his nose to the ground, guiding them like a hunter tracking prey. After what felt like an hour, the man finally stopped in a small clearing. The remains of an old stone structure sat at its center, collapsed walls and broken beams covered in vines and decay. "This used to be the heart of the village," the man said, his voice tinged with something that sounded like regret. "Before it all changed, before they took control." Ethan glanced around, the weight of the place settling over him. "And what exactly is this?" The man stepped closer to the rubble, brushing aside dirt and debris to reveal a set of stone steps leading underground. "A safe house," he said, "built long before the church ever stood. But what's buried here goes deeper than stone and dirt." Ethan hesitated, his eyes scanning the shadows. "And you're sure this is safe?" "It's safer than standing out here." With a nod, Ethan followed him down the steps, Max at his heels. The passage was narrow, the walls damp and lined with roots that had pushed their way through over time. The air smelled of earth and age, but it felt solid, protected. The tunnel opened into a small chamber, lit only by the soft glow of a lantern the man pulled from a shelf. Ethan set the lockbox down on a dusty table, brushing away cobwebs before flipping it open again. The papers inside felt heavier now, their meaning clearer with every revelation. The man leaned over, his eyes scanning the documents quickly. "This isn't just about money," he said. "It's about control. Eleanor wasn't the first to uncover it, but she got closer than anyone else. Too close." Ethan swallowed the knot in his throat. "And now it's my turn." The man straightened, his face hard. "You're not alone," he said, "but you need to understand something. This doesn't end with exposing them. They'll fight to keep their secrets buried, and they don't care who gets caught in the crossfire." Ethan met his gaze. "Then we don't give them the chance." A sudden noise from above made them both freeze. Max growled low, his body lowering into a defensive stance. Footsteps echoed through the tunnel entrance, slow and deliberate. "They found us," the man whispered. Ethan reached for the lockbox, securing it under his arm. "Then let's make sure they regret it." The man grabbed a rusted crowbar from the wall, and Max's growls deepened, his teeth bared as the footsteps grew closer. The shadows in the tunnel shifted, and for the first time, Ethan saw the faces of the men stepping into view. Cold eyes, hardened expressions, and behind them, Father Thomas. "Give me the box," Thomas said, his voice calm but filled with venom. "You have no idea what you're playing with." Ethan squared his shoulders. "Neither do you." The tension snapped like a wire and everything erupted at once. Max lunged first, his bark echoing through the chamber as the men surged forward. Ethan didn't wait. He gripped the lockbox tighter and charged, knowing that this moment, the fight for the truth, had only just begun. Months later, life slowly returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such a harrowing experience. John was rebuilding his business, stronger and more focused than ever, while Max had settled comfortably into his new role as not just a loyal companion, but a local legend. Everywhere they went, people stopped to take pictures, offer treats, and share their own stories of how animals had touched their lives. One afternoon, Keanu dropped by unannounced, his signature smile and easygoing charm lighting up John's living room. Max greeted him with excited barks and a wagging tail, but Keanu wasn't just there for a casual visit. He had an idea. "You ever think about sharing Max's story on a bigger stage?" Keanu asked, leaning back in the chair. John raised an eyebrow. "You mean like a book or something?" "Or something," Keanu replied with a grin. "People need to hear stories like this, not just because it's inspiring, but because it reminds them to trust their instincts, to listen to the small signals we so often overlook." John hesitated for a moment, then looked down at Max, who was curled up by his feet. "You think people would really care that much?" Keanu leaned forward, his voice steady. "They already do. Look around you. People need hope, John. They need stories that remind them there's still good in the world, and that sometimes heroes come with fur and paws." Inspired by Keanu's words, John agreed, and together they started working on a project that would celebrate Max's courage and highlight the extraordinary bond between humans and animals. But as the story took shape, something remarkable began to happen. People from all over the world reached out, sharing tales of their own pets' bravery, stories of dogs sensing danger, cats saving lives, and animals offering comfort in the darkest moments. It was more than a story now. It was a movement. And through it all, Max remained the same humble hero, content to sit by John's side, chase sticks, and greet strangers with his ever-wagging tail. If this story reminded you of the powerful connection we share with animals, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to see more inspiring stories like this one, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe, because sometimes the most powerful stories aren't just about what happens, they're about who stands by your side when it does. As the weeks turned into months, the story of Max and John continued to ripple across communities, touching hearts and inspiring conversations, far beyond what anyone had imagined. Schools invited John and Max to speak about courage and resilience. Animal shelters saw a surge in adoptions, as people were reminded of the extraordinary bonds that pets can bring into their lives. News outlets followed up with updates, and Max's face became a symbol of loyalty and love, appearing on magazine covers and social media campaigns. But for John, the real transformation wasn't in the headlines. It was in the quiet moments he now cherished more than ever. Evening walks with Max became rituals of gratitude, each step a reminder of how fragile life could be and how easily it could be taken for granted. He often found himself reflecting on the nightmarish moment inside the church, remembering the helplessness he'd felt, until Max's bark shattered the silence and changed everything. Keanu remained a steady presence in their lives, checking in often and even helping John create a short documentary about the experience. The project wasn't just about retelling what had happened. It was about reminding people to listen, to pay attention to the details that others might overlook, and to trust the instincts that can sometimes mean the difference between life and death. One evening, as the three of them sat watching the sunset, John looked over at Keanu and said, "You know, I never asked, why didn't you walk away that day? Most people would have trusted the priest, ignored the dog, and left." Keanu smiled, his eyes thoughtful. "Because sometimes the signs are too loud to ignore, and sometimes you just have to believe that something bigger is at work." Max let out a soft bark, as if agreeing, and the three of them sat quietly, letting the moment sink in. Stories like this aren't just about miracles. They're about the choices we make when faced with uncertainty. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. Share your own moments of trust, courage, or even a time when an animal changed your life. And if you want to hear more stories that celebrate bravery, love, and the bonds that connect us, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Because sometimes the most unforgettable stories are the ones that remind us to listen, to trust, and to never stop believing in the impossible. As time passed, John's life took on a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just the man who had been saved. He had become a voice for hope and resilience. With Max always by his side, he began speaking at events, sharing their incredible story, and raising awareness about the importance of trusting instincts, both human and animal. People listened, not just because the story was extraordinary, but because it felt personal. It reminded them of moments in their own lives when a gut feeling or a loyal friend had made all the difference. Keanu continued to support John, often appearing alongside him at events. Despite his fame, he remained humble, always shifting the spotlight back to Max, the true hero. At one particular event, a young girl approached Keanu and John with tears in her eyes. She shared how her rescue dog had once alerted her family to a fire, giving them just enough time to escape safely. "Your story reminded me that dogs don't just love us, they protect us," she said, hugging Max tightly. Moments like that only strengthened John's resolve. He and Keanu expanded their efforts, launching a foundation dedicated to training rescue dogs as therapy and service animals. Max became the face of the campaign, and his story reached even more people, inspiring countless adoptions and donations to animal shelters. But through all the attention, John never lost sight of the simple truth. The bond he shared with Max wasn't about headlines or applause. It was about trust, loyalty, and the kind of love that doesn't need words to be understood. Every time Max rested his head on John's lap or looked up with those soulful eyes, John was reminded of how fragile life had been and how one bark had changed everything. As John stood on stage one evening, sharing their story with yet another packed auditorium, he paused and looked down at Max, who was calmly lying at his feet. "I thought I was rescuing him when I first brought him home," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the truth is, he rescued me." The room erupted into applause, but John barely noticed. He knelt down, ruffled Max's fur, and whispered, "Thank you, buddy, for everything." If this story moved you, we'd love to hear about the incredible animals that have made a difference in your life. Drop a comment below and share your story. And if you want to see more inspiring tales of courage, loyalty, and love, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Because sometimes the greatest heroes aren't the ones we expect. They're the ones who walk beside us every single day. Months turned into years, but the bond between John and Max only grew stronger. Max had become more than a loyal companion. He was a living reminder of the power of trust, courage, and second chances. The foundation John and Keanu started flourished, providing training, support, and homes for hundreds of rescue animals. Stories poured in from around the world, tales of dogs saving lives, offering comfort, and teaching humans lessons about loyalty that words could never fully capture. One afternoon, as John and Keanu walked Max through a quiet park, a stranger approached them. She carried a small, scruffy dog in her arms and tears in her eyes. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "I adopted him after hearing Max's story. I was going through one of the hardest times in my life, and I didn't think I could make it. But this little guy, he saved me." John knelt to pet the dog, smiling warmly. "No," he said softly, "you saved each other." Moments like this had become common, yet they never lost their meaning. Each story reminded John of how his own life had changed and how one bark had set off a chain reaction of hope. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and Max rested by the fireplace, John reflected on how far they'd come. He looked over at Keanu, who was flipping through photos of their foundation's latest success stories. "You ever think about how different things could have been?" John asked. Keanu smiled, setting the photos down. "All the time. But then I remember, it wasn't just luck. It was instinct, trust, and a dog who refused to give up." John nodded, reaching down to stroke Max's fur. "And maybe a little bit of fate." Max wagged his tail as if agreeing, his eyes reflecting the warmth of the fire. This story isn't just about a dog who saved a life. It's about the unseen connections that bind us, the moments that test us, and the choices that define us. It reminds us that courage can come in unexpected forms and that loyalty, once earned, lasts a lifetime. As the fire crackled softly and Max rested peacefully by John's side, it was clear that their journey had changed them both forever. And though the shadows of the past had been left behind, the bond they shared would continue to guide them toward brighter days. See you next time with another incredible story.